He's Ed, I'm Huw, we're the Tone Twins.
We're here for Guitar.com today and we're looking at these rather magnificent Fender amplifiers.
Yeah, two Fender Deluxe amplifiers from the early 60s from two distinct eras.
So what we've got here today is a 1961 brown panel and a 1965 black panel amplifier. Tonally, these amplifiers are huge distance apart, even though only a couple of years difference in age.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the odd thing is that the Fender Deluxe name or model designation had actually been around since the very beginning of the company. So I think the first one appeared in 1948, which is the 5A3 Deluxe, evolved all the way through the 1950s. And then
the famous Tweed amplifiers.
Exactly. So the Tweed era ended with the 5E3 Deluxe, which was actually available at the same time as this one was introduced in 1961. And then, of course, massive changes were made then with the brown panel era and then onto the black panel era. And the last of them, and in a sense the one that's regarded as the pinnacle of the Fender Deluxe designs, is the Deluxe Reverb, which was introduced in 1963. Internally, there's a massive difference between the two of them. They're very, very different designs, and in some senses the brown panel Deluxe is seen as a stepping stone between the Tweed era, which ended with the 5E3, and the black panel era, which is exemplified by the Deluxe and the Deluxe Reverb.
It's come to typify what is simply known as the Fender tone, the reverb, the tremolo, the mid-scoop, the black panel Deluxe, I mean. But hopefully, as you'll see today, there's a huge range of other tones available from both these amplifiers. how did the circuits sort of evolve?
Well, the differences are such that it's tantamount to an almost entirely different amplifier. If you look at the power stage, for example, Fender started running the black panel amps at much higher voltages. They also made some other modifications around the power tube, so they were trying to squeeze more clean headroom and more power out of them. The brown panel Deluxe is kind of on its own, really, because there's some really weird stuff in the particularly around the first valve with regard to the plate resistor and the cathode resistors. And what it means is that you get a really, really hot front end. Okay, so the amplifier just wants to distort all the time, which is the antithesis of the kind of black panel sound, where Leo Fender and his crew were obviously trying to make them run as clean as possible. The really big difference between them is actually in what's known as the tone stack, and the tone control and the way the tone control was connected to the volume control in the brown panel was much closer to the kind of mid-sized Tweed amplifiers of the 1950s. But with the advent of the black panel Deluxes, this new tone stack was introduced. You had treble and bass, and you also had mid, but the mid was preset. Okay, so you couldn't adjust it, and if you set both the bass and treble controls to about the halfway point, around about 5, what you'd end up with is what's called the smiley face curve. So you're actually getting a bass and treble boost. So the middle is kind of flat, bass and treble boost. So that's what's known as the mid scoop kind of tone, and it sucked quite a lot of signal level out of the sound. So what they did then, they had to have another gain stage to actually bring it back up.
So the two channels on the brown panel Deluxe outwardly seem similar in terms of both have got a volume and a tone control, but there are some circuit differences which equate to sonic differences.
Yeah, I mean, there's nowhere near the amount of circuit differences that there are between these two, because these are very, very different electronically. The channels in this amplifier are essentially identical. There's really just two components in it, so they changed the value of the capacitor in the tone stack. Well, if you can call it a tone stack, they changed the value of the capacitor tied to the tone control. And the other thing they did was it's quite unusual. There's a little capacitor that basically bridges the plate resistor going to the first valve in the normal channel, and what that does is it dumps some of the high frequency content to ground. So the way they made the bright channel brighter was actually by making the normal channel duller. The brown panel Deluxe has a tremolo circuit which is pretty much derived. It's an adaptation, really, of the kind of circuit that they used in the Tweed Vibrolux. So it uses one half of a 12AX7 triode.
And to do with the output valves as well, it's sort of is it changing the volume of the output valves?
Well, what it's doing is it's changing the bias of the output valves, because that was another thing that both these amplifiers have in common, is that they're fixed bias amplifiers. All the Deluxes that went before in the Tweed era had cathode biasing, but these are fixed bias. So this enabled them to use this kind of bias tremolo, and it works really, really well. They moved away from that almost immediately with the black panel Deluxes, and rather than working on the power valves, what it actually does is it works earlier on in the circuit in the preamp stage, and they did it in a different way. They actually used a whole triode, so basically both sides of a triode valve, which I think is a 12AX7 triode. And the other thing they used was something called an Opto Coupler. And what an Opto Coupler is a light source, like a little light bulb, with a photosensitive resistor. So they were actually getting the tremolo from...
completely different way.
Yeah, exactly, and it responds in a completely different way. And what they did was they put these two components together, put black heat shrink around them, and you had these 4 little leads coming out of them, and they're commonly called roaches.
the differences. The brown tremolo is far more swampy, deeper, sort of intense effect.
Yeah.
Bit rounder sort of waveform almost. The black panel is sort of choppier, that real classic sort of 60s choppy trem, I guess.
Yeah, it's a real kind of like fluttery sound, and it's that kind of thing where you sometimes you don't hear the front of the note or the front of the chord. With the black panel one, I find that it's an effect I want to switch on and then switch off. It's a special effect, whereas with the bias trem on the brown panel, wow, it's just something I would just leave on all the time.
The tremolo on the brown panel deluxe works on both channels, whereas on the black panel it only works on this channel. Same with the reverb, isn't it? So this is quite a poorer relation of a channel to some degree.
It's weird, isn't it? Because a lot of black panel deluxe owners, they and the similar amps, they don't actually use that channel at all, and it's quite strange because if you do plug into the normal channel, it's actually a really cool sound.
And then the classic sound, of course, is the vibrato channel with the beautiful spring reverb, which of course the brown panel doesn't have. A bit of tremolo. It's a sound you hear on countless records.
Fender spring reverb. It's just amazing. You know, even after all this time, it just never gets old.
To put them in a quick ballpark, the brown panel is ZZ Top.
Yeah, lots of people call them mini Marshalls, which I think is actually a bit of a lazy and misleading analogy. Really, it's a completely different type of overdrive that doesn't have that fierceness. It doesn't have that aggression. It overdrives massively. I mean, don't get me wrong.
It is like a more refined tweed. There's still a lot of punch and gain. Whereas with the black panel amps, it's like they went in a completely other direction, isn't it? Tonally, obviously, we've talked about the EQ differences, and it's a much less gainy amp.
Yeah.
Clean tones, obviously renowned for its clean tones. When turned up, some lovely sort of mild break-up bluesy tones. A classic, you put some Paths or 335 or Les Paul into it. Yeah. Get Mike Bloomfield, and you get
those. But you put a Les Paul into this, and it's ZZ Top off the first two albums. I know that neither of these amplifiers have the original speakers, so which ones do you think would have been fitted originally in the Fender factory?
I think in this period they used the Oxford ceramic speakers. Certainly would have come with the brown panel, and they'd used a range of speakers in the black panel era, but I think Oxford would have been right for this amp. This amp has now got an Alnico Celestion Ruby in there.
Oh, so one of the new ones.
One of the new ones. Yeah. It's great, seems to handle the power. Being a 20 watt amp, a Celestion Blue rated at about 15 watts can't quite handle it. It's a bit
marginal.
Yeah. And then there's a George Alessandro ceramic speaker, which is one of the highly regarded sort of American tone.
That's an eminence
American sort of tone speaker, and it seems to work really well with this circuit. So the difficult question: which is your favourite?
Oh, that's not a difficult question for me at all. I just love the brown panel deluxe. It just does everything for me. I love the way it overdrives. I love its dynamic response. I find it endlessly interesting. It sounds amazing, whatever guitar you plug into it, and the tremolo for me beats the black panel tremolo hands down. I love it.
I find it a bit more tricky because although I absolutely adore the tones from the brown panel, it's such a great responsive, interactive, gainy, crunchy amp. There's something timeless about the tones from the Deluxe Reverb for me. You know, it's on so many records. You plug in any guitar and it just instantly transports you back to that 60s sound typified by the spring reverb and the trem. So it's a tougher shootout, and I'd happily take either.